BSides DC would like to thank all of our sponsors, and a special thank you to all of our speakers, volunteers, and organizers.
If I start kind of losing volume, just let me know. Sometimes I kind of trail off a little bit, kind of my Midwest monotone voice going to work. But anyways, thank you guys so much for being here today. I'd like to kind of talk to you about some things that I find interesting, and I'm hoping that you guys might take an interest in some of the things I have to talk about. First things first, I would like to just thank my company, White Ops, for giving me some time to put together some slide decks and be here to talk with you folks. My boss was very supportive in giving me some time on Friday to feverishly put together the last few slides I have here. So just wanted to give them a shout out. All right, so today, for those of you that know me, there's a few familiar faces in the room. I see one of my former co-speakers back there, Chris. How you doing, Chris? My name is John Laycock. I've been in the InfoSec space for quite a few years now. I actually started out in forensic video many years ago and was able to pivot over into computer forensics, working over at DC3 for a long time, and worked in a couple of different directorates there. After that, I went over to our commercial forensics team and kind of bounced around. As you can see there, I've worked at Fidelis on their threat research team for a couple of years before going over to Medicare, working in their SOC, and currently I'm a threat intel manager with White Ops. And I have a Twitter handle, Malware Elf. Not really that interesting, I don't think. I just kind of retweet things that I find interesting, maybe make a few sarcastic comments now and again. But if you want to reach out to me after this talk, that's a pretty good place to find me. So the title of my talk today, as you can see, is Looking to the Past to Better Understand Threat Intelligence. And this is something that kind of marries up two topics that I find very interesting and fascinating. Genealogy and threat intel research. Just out of curiosity, does anybody in here study their family history at all? Really? Okay, great. So genealogy for me has been kind of an interesting thing. I guess, why am I kind of talking about these two things together? The simple answer is I like solving a puzzle. Kind of going through that family history. It's a lot like threat intel. You're trying to figure out where something came from, how did it get to be there, and just figuring it out. And that's something in combination with history. I've always had a lot of interest in solving puzzles and just where did we come from, and your family. I mean, it's kind of a kind of a really kind of basic need for me, I guess. I was very fortunate. I had a grandmother, so she really was kind of our family historian, had a lot of knowledge, and I was very close with her, and so I kind of learned a lot of my own family history from her. And when my son was born, I kind of had a renewed interest. She had passed away a couple years before that, but I kind of had a renewed interest in figuring out where did my family come from. I knew bits and pieces, and things that I kind of put together, and sometimes you kind of misremember things. From growing up, you think, oh well, this is what it was, and then you start digging into it, and you kind of realize that things were a little bit different than the way you remembered them. And I started just looking around. I got online. And saw there were a lot of different sources. I actually went to my public library and went through census data and did a lot of the things that genealogists will go and do. And very early on, I had been told through our family history that we had some ancestors that were in the Revolutionary War. And that really interested me. I always like having a goal when I do these things, right? And so I decided I wanted to try to trace my family roots back to Revolutionary War and maybe get into the Sons of the American Revolution, which is a great group. Does anybody here remember that by chance? You are? Okay, great. Which chapter are you with? Okay, I'm Westminster out of Maryland. So, one of the first things I did is I set up an Ancestry.com account. And, I started looking around, and that kind of started a 7-year effort to get through and get that documentation together and go through my lineage. On the flip side here with threat intel, it's kind of a similar thing. I started out doing a lot of computer forensics. I kind of migrated into network forensics a little bit. I got to work in a SOC. I worked on a threat research team, and threat intel was really a nice place for me to kind of take my very kind of wide background and my experiences and apply them into a threat intel mindset, and kind of start doing threat analysis. And so what I think we're going to find here as I go through this talk today is that these two topics actually have a lot of overlap. I mean, at their essence, they're just research. So your basic research methodology is going to be very similar, whether it's genealogy or threat intel analysis. So what I learned, and you guys can see, up here, genealogy research is not easy. Like I said, it took me 7 years to figure out, where and get all the documents together I needed to join the Sons of the American Revolution. I also learned through a lot of trial and error to take notes. And this is true of both, right? If you don't take notes, you start going down a path, and then all of a sudden you forget where you were, an hour ago. You've been clicking through all these different websites, and you lose track of your place very easy. Ancestry.com, as great as it is, it's not the complete solution. Okay, it doesn't beat going down to maybe a state archive somewhere, going down to your public library, maybe a local historical society. Just like VirusTotal, great tool, and I'm not bashing them. That was the first name that popped into my head. Okay, I use VirusTotal a lot. It's a great tool, but it's not all inclusive. Sometimes you have no frame of reference for where maybe a sample came from. Multiple sources, critical. If you can tie in multiple pieces of documentation, they're really important to help you with your analysis. And you just, the Russian proverb, trust but verify. Okay, again, very important. We need to be able to trust our sources. We need to have some veracity to their information. And don't jump to conclusions, right? It's very easy to do. You want to jump, when you start doing your research, a lot of times you want to jump right to the end point. Slow down. Make sure you have your documents together, your proof. It's very important. And you're always going to find contradictions and things that don't line up just right. Okay? And that's true whether it's threat analysis or whether it's genealogy. Okay? And I'll talk a little bit about some of that as we go along here, but those contradictions are really important. And it's okay to embrace them. Okay? When you do your report, your threat intel report, or you do your genealogy research, just put it out there. Okay? Somebody else may know what that is. It might trigger something. Okay? It might help them explain something and help you learn a little bit as well. So, if you're interested in getting into genealogy, here's a great place to start, and that's with your family. Ask questions. As close as I was to my grandmother, there are a lot of questions that in hindsight I wish I would have asked. And that's something that happens, and when you're younger you don't think about these things. There's a lot, if she was here today, there's a lot of things I would like to know. She was born in 1912. Her grandfather was a Civil War veteran. Think about that. That's 160 years of experiences and knowledge. And I have stories, but I wish I had more. Okay. One other aside, didn't really fit in here, but I wanted to talk about it. If you have old family photos, label them. Okay. I went through my other grandmother's. I have boxes of pictures. Some of these are pictures from the 20s and 30s, and there's people on there, they look like they're having a great time, they're smiling and laughing, but I have no clue who they are. Okay? And I have these photos because I'm like, well, what do I do with these? I did go through and badger a whole bunch of aunts and uncles and cousins. I said, hey, who are these people? And I was able to identify some, but not all. So if you do have some old photos, take some time to label them if you know who those people are. It's really important. The other thing that's useful when you're getting started in genealogy, you probably have a family member that has done a lot of research already. You're going to have a family historian. And maybe Aunt Harriet or somebody else, Cousin Bob or somebody. And it's really important to identify those people. Maybe you don't know that they're the family historian, and they may have a lot of information for you already. And that will help you in your research. Maybe they've gone down a lot of paths that you're about to go on, and you can benefit from their knowledge. But, as the picture here shows with William Wallace, beware family lore. Okay? I have a great example of this from my own experiences. My grandmother had told me, I grew up north of Chicago in Lake County, Illinois, and there's a small town there called Gray's Lake. I have an ancestor from the area named Gray, and my grandmother had told me that was our family, our kin. And so I thought that was pretty cool. And so I actually, as I started to do my family research, I called down to the local historical society and said, hey, yeah, I'm a descendant of the Grays of Gray's Lake, and I'd like to know, if you have any information or anything like that. And in talking to some of the folks at the historical society there, I found out that there were actually a couple of Gray families that had located into the area there in the 1850s. And my family was not one of the families that Gray's Lake was named for. And that's okay. That's just, you kind of get that family lore where it snowballs down over 150 years, and it's very easy to make assumptions like that. What I did find out about my particular line as I did some additional research is that they were actually French. They had come from upstate New York and France before that, obviously, but they had changed their names after the Revolutionary War from LaPierre to Gray. So, again, you need to kind of walk through these things and kind of learn about them. There's some more family lore with the LaPierre that I haven't been able to substantiate. My grandmother has told me that LaPierre was apparently a doctor for General Lafayette, but I haven't been able to verify that one. So we have to kind of keep in mind of this as we go along and do our research. So on the threat intel side, we have very similar things here, right? So when you start doing threat intel analysis, even if you're working in a SOC, or if you're working in maybe a company and you have a lot of customer telemetry coming back, great place to start, talk to your coworkers. Learn about your environments that you're working in, just like you would talk with your family members. Find network diagrams. Understand your data sets, where everything is coming from. Understand the relationships, what kind of data you have, what kind of limitations that are in place with that data. Can you use this publicly? Can you not use this publicly? Where did it come from? What does it show you? Is it incomplete? Is it reliable? So whether that's on a network diagram or just understanding where the data is, that's another step that you want to put into place. You learn about your company processes, your IT stacks. Understand where things fit, where we're looking inside of your network, so that you can make sure that you're making the right conclusions when you do look at this stuff. Hey, Damien, how you doing? Thanks for coming. So, but just like we have to worry about family lore, we also need to worry about the from what I know type of remarks. Okay, because that can really lead you astray. Somebody may have an understanding of something, that information may be outdated, it may even be incorrect. And so a great story I have where I encountered that, I was working in a SOC, and we had a mouse spam campaign coming through our email. And I had a couple of emails I needed to take a look at. And I started parsing the email headers just to kind of get a feel. That was something I'd always do, just to kind of get a feel for maybe where the email originated, maybe some interesting things. And I started looking, I realized there was a bunch of missing information in the network hops. It didn't have the normal path that I would expect for our emails coming into our servers. It was missing a large chunk of our security stack. So it was really literally coming from the outside world right into our servers and then right to the end users. And I was concerned, as you can imagine. So we started looking around, and because this was a large organization, we had different teams, different contracts to administrate different parts of our network. So there was kind of a natural disconnect. And so as I was talking to my coworkers, I got a lot of from what I know type of remarks. From what I know, Joe handles that, or Dave handles that, or from what I know, that's configured to go here and then here and wind its way through our network. And as I started digging around, we finally got to a point where we contacted our email server team and engaged them and started talking to them. and kind of explain what we thought the issue, what there was an issue going on, and they were able to. We had just actually recently went to Office 365, and when we incorporated Office 365 into our email service, the email security stack, Office 365 has their own security within their product. We had actually had a third-party security stack, and so we had chosen not to go with the Microsoft offering. And when we did that, we did not know, we had some configuration errors within our setup. And so when we did that, what was happening is that anytime we got an email that looked like it was coming from an internal user, it just sent it right through because it assumed it had already gone through our security stack. So we had mail spam going right to the end users, never going through security. Obviously a big problem. It was actually, once we got the Microsoft engineers involved in this, they were able to help us write up a couple of transport rules, and that basically forced all emails to go through our security stack. So point being here is that I had to dig through and kind of get through the from what I know and kind of break through the barriers a little bit and make sure that I understood the problem. And that helped us improve our security posture as a result. So Ancestry.com, and I've mentioned it a couple of times already, is really probably a starting point for a lot of folks when they get into genealogy. And it's a great tool. There's a lot of information up there. In addition to just the kind of social aspects of maybe connecting with some family members, you have massive amounts of databases that they've kind of incorporated into their system. They alert you on it. Anything from census data, marriage certificates, ship manifest data, military records. And we probably have all seen the commercials. When they identify a match, they give you a little leaf, telling you you've got some new family connection to go check out. That should start to sound a little familiar to you. That should be like what maybe if you've used a SIM or a TIP, when you get an alert. Okay, same idea here. It really is. I had actually, I mentioned the social aspect. I connected with a distant cousin I had never met before. He lives up over in Philadelphia. He's a lawyer out there. And he'd actually done a lot of research on my family. And like I said, I'd never met him. He had never met any of my family out in northern Illinois, even though he had actually come out a couple of times. And so we got to talking, and we did a lot of research together. Great guy. We actually worked with one of my first cousins that I know, and we found the ship manifest for when my ancestor came into the country. So in the 1820s, I actually have a John Laycock that came to America, came into Philadelphia. I thought that was a lot of fun for me. Don, my cousin Don, later found his citizenship applications, and kind of looking through the documents, we realized that he was illiterate. He actually had to make his mark on the paperwork. So there's a lot of really interesting things that you can find out from these old documents. You think, the 1820s, what am I going to learn from this? Well, I learned he was illiterate when he came to America. Some people might argue I'm illiterate, but it's interesting to kind of know where we came from with this stuff. The other thing that you have to really think about with any sort of crowdsourced data is it is crowdsourced. Okay, what is the quality of it? It may not be diligently sourced. You have to sort through a lot of extraneous information, and you got to look at the data and the source and figure out, hey, is this trustworthy? Can I trust this? It's very easy to get into Ancestry.com and just start clicking things, and all of a sudden you've got 10, 12 generations of family going back to Norway or wherever the heck it might be. But if you made a wrong turn 2 or 3 generations back, you got to make sure you have the sources to support what you're doing. And if you go online and you see somebody else's family tree and you see that they've gone through these 10 or 12 generations, you might think, hey, they've done the work here. Not necessarily. Okay, you have to really parse through it a little bit and double check on it. Those little leaves, they might be giving you a lead, but it might be a false positive, right? It might be another John Laycock or another John Smith somewhere. And so you've got to really make sure that, does this make sense? Just like you have to look at that with some of the data you might do when you're doing threat intel analysis. So corollary to using Ancestry.com might be using a threat intel platform, a tip, okay? Once you kind of evolve to a certain point in your analysis, you're probably going to be wanting to look at any one of the multitude of tips that are out there. I won't get into the specifics of a tip, but basically just a place to aggregate all your data, take your feeds, bring in your data and do some data enrichment, whatever it is you need to do for your particular job function. Okay. These systems are really important, and they really help you out by going through a lot of data, enriching it for you, looking at your feeds, and really giving you a rich data set to go through and help you in your day-to-day analysis. Now, just like when you get that leaf, you got to think about the source of the information, all right? Just because you've got a feed that says this IP address is malicious, that doesn't mean it is, right? How many of us have heard the story of the young SOC analyst that blocked 8.8.8.8, right? So, I mean, it's almost kind of a trope now. I don't know if it really ever happened or not, but, at some point somewhere, I'm sure somebody blocked Google, but they learned from that, I would hope. At the end of the day, you've got to do your own vetting of the data, just like you do in genealogy. You've got to make sure you have good data that you're looking at. Also consider cost. I didn't really speak about this on the Ancestry the previous slide, but there's a lot of information that's available out there. Some of it's free, some of it is free and good, some of it's free and not so good, and some of it's going to cost you a lot of money and it's crap. Some of it, it just depends on what you're doing. So you need to really consider the cost. Am I getting value for this? Is this useful or not? Now, as you go through and do your research, whether it's on threat intel or genealogy, you're going to hit a brick wall. That's what we call it in ancestry. I'm sorry, genealogy, sorry. You're going to hit a brick wall. You're going to get stuck. And this is where you start to evolve and become a better genealogy researcher, a better analyst, is, when you do get stuck, what do? You got to get creative. You've got to start looking around, get different approaches, kind of break out of your bubble and start to look at things differently. Maybe get out from behind the keyboard, go to a library somewhere, go to a local history center, maybe a church, maybe mail a letter, okay? So my brick wall, as I was going through, and I said it took me 7 years to get the Sons of the American Revolution application through. So my brick wall was my great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Gray. And she was buried in a small cemetery back home in Diamond Lake, Illinois in 1852. And one of the problems I had with her was I knew her married name, and this is not an unusual problem, but because she was married in 1842, I think, and I don't have proof on this is just a suspicion of mine based on her children's ages, but the census data starting in 1850, all the census data every year or every 10 years changes, and they ask for different pieces of information. So starting in 1850, they start to list out all the inhabitants of a house. Well, prior to that, they only told you who the head of the household was and gave you a count of who might have lived in the house. And so that makes it kind of difficult sometimes to find out, maybe who all the children are for a particular family. And so that was kind of my situation here. So Mary Gray, she's married, passes away in 1852. I don't have older census data to link her to her family. I mentioned I believe she was married around 1842 in upstate New York. At that time, there were no death records kept in Lake County, Illinois in the 1850s. I didn't have an obituary that I could find. I did find later on, actually I contacted the cemetery, and she was one of the first people buried at this particular cemetery. They had to pull out the old book. They didn't even have it in their records, and they had records showing that her husband bought 4 cemetery plots and that she was buried there along with a couple of other family members. But they didn't have much more information for me. However, I found one of her daughter's death certificates from 1925, and it lists out her mother's maiden name. So now I have her maiden name of Soper. And I'm fairly certain I know who her family is. I know where they're from, upstate New York. I just don't have the links tying her to her parents. I have a number of her siblings, that I've managed to connect back to the parents through other records, but not Mary Gray. She was one of the first ones to leave the home. So her father actually was kind of interesting, and so at this point I had been trying to go up to Mary Gray, so now I'm kind of coming down from up on top from her father and her grandfather. Her father actually served in the War of 1812, and there are records available at the National Archives. So I reached out to the National Archives, got a wonderful trove of information, but nothing tying me to Mary Gray, unfortunately. Later on, I actually there were a number of letters, handwritten letters, to the U.S. government that were in this packet. This was part of land bounty applications. So when you served in the War of 1812, you were actually able to get a couple hundred acres out west. They would give it to you for your service. And so this ancestor, his wife, had been applying for that, and she had written affidavits from people. And so I had a number of handwritten letters, which were interesting, but again, not tying me back to my ancestor, Mary Gray. Joseph Soper is this gentleman's name. His father actually served in the Revolutionary War, and so again, I don't have records, leading back to there as well. So it's kind of frustrating, but I kind of banged my head on this brick wall for quite a while, and finally, I realized I needed to kind of go around and come at this from a different angle. And so one of my cousins actually had been doing a lot of research. She kind of suggested, why don't you look down this family line a little bit and see if you find something? And that's where I was able to kind of break through that wall and kind of go around and come at this from another angle. And I'll come back to that in a few slides here and talk about that, the ancestor that I eventually tied into. So just like in genealogy where we hit a brick wall, we're going to hit that in threat intelligence too. And sometimes you'll find it just, you may have something that just stops you in your tracks. And this is where you have to start getting creative in your research. Sometimes you might want to go through some paid sources. You may need to talk to some folks that you work with. Maybe reach out to some colleagues that you've worked with in a past, previous stop. Maybe do some good old-fashioned OSINT. I know kind of an increasingly frustrating avenue for researching domains is privacy managers. A lot of us run into those, and we're kind of stopped because the who is information we've had in the past just isn't there anymore. Sometimes we can go through, and if we have some good sources, we can go through and do some historical who is registration information. We might get lucky if the domain's old enough. And maybe find an old email address that had been used several years ago and start doing some searches on that. One thing I've done and been able to do is I'll go through and look at the page source on a domain I'm researching. And sometimes you might find something like a Google Analytics ID or some other kind of unique string that's kind of interesting. And then I'll turn around and use public www to do a search for that string. And that'll help me tie together several domains that I might not have realized that were associated with each other. So we can start to use some different tricks to help us tie things together. Another thing I'll do sometimes is I'll look at the IP address. Maybe there's some other domains that are co-located together. Again, you have to be careful with that because it just may be a public IP address, but if you have 2 or 3 different domains on a particular IP, they might be related. Another area that I know there was a talk this morning about Ja3 hashes. Did anybody here get to see that talk? Okay, yeah, I know. Good talk. It's a good concept. There's a lot of work that's being done in that space that might be useful for some of this type of research. So kind of break out of that mold and start thinking about different approaches, and maybe kind of, instead of going in through the front door, maybe go around to the back door and get your way in. Oh. Sorry. So that all kind of leads to where I am now. And last year I was able to put together an application for my Sons of the American Revolution membership. And this is not unlike doing a detailed report. Okay, you have to pull all this information together. You have to grab all kinds of birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, any supporting information to help you establish your relationship to your ancestors. I took a lot of time and went through and laid this out in a very logical. I worked with my sponsor at the organization, and he helped me lay it out in a very clear, concise manner so we could get the application packets in. And it has to go through several layers of review, just like if you're going through a review process for a report you're working on. It's a very similar thing. So I had to go through my local chapter, state level, and then up to the national level folks. So one of the gaps I had in my application, and the state officers kind of pointed this out, is my great-grandmother's death certificate wasn't included with my application. And he's like, why isn't it here? You need this in here. Well, we had, with my local chapter, we decided to not include that because there was a discrepancy. Remember, I talked about embracing discrepancies, right? Well, what we found on the death certificate was my great uncle, he had actually gone in, he reported her death and filled out the death certificate. And there was a field in there where he put father's name. Okay, and Uncle Duffy literally put his dad's name instead of his mother's father's name. So this was causing, some confusion. To add to that, his father's name and his grandfather's name were both William. So there was a lot of, we weren't sure, who was what. And so when I was working with my local sponsor, he said, let's put this on the side because this is going to cause some questions. Well, by not putting it in there and explaining it and taking the time to explain, hey, yes, we have this death certificate, we know there's some errors in here, we have supporting documentation showing the proper relationships here, it caused some questions when it went up to the state level and actually slowed down my application process. So sometimes we think we're trying to be clear and not, just don't pay attention to this. Sometimes it's important to embrace those discrepancies. And so we went ahead and put that in, and it cleared some things up. The other thing that I did, most of the time you're looking for census records, and the big three that they look for when they can get them are birth certificates, marriage, and death certificates. But when you start getting back into the 17 and 1800s, you have to get a little creative. And one of the unusual sources of data that I had, I actually had to mail away for this. I couldn't just, pull it up online, right? I actually had to, kind of get out there and do some things the old way. Is I had to send away for a copy of a local history book, and in particular, this was out of Osage County, Missouri, where my grandmother had grown up. And there was a local history book from 1890 that had a bunch of my family history in there, and had a bunch of so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. It kind of read like the Silmarillion a little bit. But it was really kind of an interesting thing to go through and see how they came to Osage County, and they later came up to Northern Illinois where I grew up. But this was a really useful source for me as well because it allowed me to get back a couple more generations. So similar to what I had to go through with the Sons of the American Revolution application, when you do threat intel analysis, at some point you're going to have to put together a report, a write-up. It could be a summary, it could be a long, detailed report. And you're going to have to do the same types of things. You're going to have to document the work that you did. You're going to have to prove, what your assertions are. How much confidence do you have in your assessments, right? And it's really, it's the same type of work. You have to carefully go through that write-up. You have to support it. And document your different things. Yeah. Okay. So, as far as my actual application itself, the ancestor I ended up going back to, his name is James Ford, and he's kind of an interesting person. You can see here. The top picture there is from a document called the Journal of the House of Burgesses of Virginia. And James was kind of an interesting guy, like I said. His father was a Huguenot. He was a French Protestant who came over to America to escape religious persecution in the late 1700s. And so James was born to his father, John Pierre. And James grew up in just outside of Richmond, Virginia, and he actually participated in the French and Indian War. And he was in the Battle of the Meadows. It's also called the Battle of Fort Necessity, which is just up over the line in Pennsylvania, which was one of the first battles of the French and Indian War, really started things. And you can see he lost an eye. And so this document that I found was him submitting a claim for restitution. And he was granted some relief. I forgot the amount, but they did approve his pension request. Later on, during the Revolutionary War, you can see in the bottom document there, picture there. During the Revolutionary War, we didn't necessarily, as a country or as a colony that didn't have a lot of money, we would give certificates to say, hey, we'll pay you back later. And so James Ford Sr. actually was given a certificate for 3 bushels of corn, and he allowed 17 horses to pasture on his land. And he was supporting the Virginia militia. I haven't done any look or research on that Armand Legion, but that might be something I do down the road. Now, I also know, I haven't done the research yet, but I know his son, James Ford Jr., was a soldier for the Virginia militia. And I'm going to probably do a supplemental application to get him notated as well. But this is all, this is the end result, right? So now, because I've done all this work, I've done all this research, now I'm a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, and I can go walk in parades and other, things like that. We do a lot of different grave markings and things like that to recognize other Revolutionary War members. Do a lot of research or outreach to kids in the schools and things like that. But at the end of the day, when we look at whether we're looking at family history or whether we're looking at threat intel research, there's a rigor. We need to make sure that we're actually going through and documenting things properly. We're putting in the work. We're making sure we vet the sources and all of those things that we have to do. So I'll give you guys back a couple of minutes here, but I want to thank everybody here for coming in and listening to me drone on about my own personal family history. I know it's probably not as interesting to you as it is to me, but thank you for your indulgence. If you haven't been doing any of this and you'd like to talk about how to get started, please come up and see me afterwards. 2 organizations here, Sons of the American Revolution, Daughters of the American Revolution. There is another group for children. Particularly, like when I applied, my son and I are both considered Sons of the American Revolution. My daughters aren't 18 yet, so they can't join the Daughters of the American Revolution, but there is a Children of the American Revolution organization that they can join. I'll be here for a little bit if anybody wants to talk shop at all or ask any questions. And just want to thank everybody for your time, and thanks for being here.